Have you ever considered that the very religious leaders who condemned Jesus were, unknowingly, fulfilling a greater prophecy? Annas and Caiaphas, two names you might only know as the priests who conspired against Christ, had a much deeper role in history. What if I told you that their actions, seen as betrayal by many, were, in fact, part of a divine plan that had already been laid out centuries before? It's a controversial idea, but the scriptures are clear. Nothing that happened was by chance. While Annas and Caiaphas were trying to maintain control over religion and politics in Jerusalem, they were sealing the fate of Israel in a way that no one expected. But how does this all connect to the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple? How could two priests, driven by human interests, fulfill what the prophets had announced long before they were born? There's something surprising in this story that few know. And today we're going to unravel how the trial of Jesus and the fate of Israel are deeply intertwined in the pages of biblical prophecy. Stay with me and get ready to see this story from a new perspective. A perspective that might make you question everything you thought you knew. Annas and Caiaphas were, without a doubt, the most influential religious figures of their time in Jerusalem. Annas, although no longer holding the official position of high priest, was still considered a powerful authority, both for his history and his influence over his family, since Caiaphas, his son-in-law, had taken over the leadership position in the T. The transition of power within this family demonstrated the deep connection between religious and political power at the time. Jerusalem, under Roman occupation, was in a moment of tremendous tension, in which religious authority often needed to negotiate its survival with the occupying forces. Annas and Caiaphas were central pieces in this delicate game. Their role, however, went beyond the simple administration of the temple. They were at the forefront of a tradition that went back centuries, with deep roots in Scripture and the promises of the Old Testament. Since the time of Moses, the priesthood had the duty to intercede for the people before God, and also to maintain the spiritual order of Israel. However, over the centuries, this responsibility became more political than spiritual. Annas and Caiaphas, then, found themselves at a crossroads: maintain the status quo and preserve their privileged positions, or recognize the true nature of the messianic mission that was beginning to manifest. This choice would define not only their personal trajectories, but the fate of all Israel. The messianic prophecies of the Old Testament, such as those of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Daniel, were deeply rooted in Jewish culture. They spoke of a king who would bring liberation, peace, and justice to. However, the expectation of this Messiah was very different from what actually happened with the coming of Jesus. The people expected a military leader who would free them from the Roman yoke, while Jesus presented himself as the Son of God, bringing a spiritual kingdom. This dissonance created immense confusion among the Jews, including among their religious leaders. Annas and Caiaphas knew these promises well, but they did not see in Jesus the fulfillment of these hopes, and this spiritual blindness led them to make decisions that would, in fact, set them against God's own designs. Tension grew as Rome's influence intensified. The temple, the spiritual and political center of Israel, was also a symbol of resistance. But Annas and Caiaphas, unlike the zealot revolutionaries who wanted to expel the Romans, preferred to preserve their alliances with the empire to ensure the stability of their positions. They saw in Jesus not the fulfillment of the prophecies, but a threat to that fragile stability. His preaching attracted crowds, questioned the hypocrisy of the religious elite, and suggested a new kind of kingdom, a kingdom they were not prepared to accept. Annas and Caiaphas, then, began to see Jesus as a problem to be solved, an uncomfortable prophet who needed to be silenced for the good of the nation. It's ironic to think that while Annas and Caiaphas tried to maintain control over the political and religious situation, they were actually paving the way for the ancient prophecies to be fulfilled. Isaiah had foreseen the suffering of the Messiah, and Psalm 22 described in detail what would happen to God's anointed one. But trapped in their own concerns, these two priests did not see that. By resisting Jesus, they were participating in the fulfillment of Scripture. Every step they took against him, every decision they made to preserve their power, was directly linked to the fulfillment of the divine plan, a plan they could never control. The prophecies of the Old Testament are like a sacred mosaic that, piece by piece, reveals the coming of the Messiah and the fate of Israel. Isaiah 53, for example, is one of the most impressive texts we find. In it, the prophet describes a suffering servant who would be despised, rejected, and punished for the sake of many. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement that brought us peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. This passage clearly points to the suffering of Jesus, a figure who did not come as a triumphant king in the military sense that many expected, but as someone who would bring redemption through his own pain. The connection to what happened during the arrest, trial, and crucifixion of Jesus is impossible to ignore. The actions of Annas and Caiaphas in this context were a trigger for the fulfillment of this ancient prophecy. Another fundamental text that cannot be forgotten is Psalm 22, which is almost like an advanced vision of the crucifixion. The psalmist writes, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The same words that Jesus uttered while hanging on the cross. Furthermore, the psalm details the scene of someone who has his hands and feet pierced, whose clothes are gambled for, and who suffers ridicule from those around him. When we read this in light of the events of the New Testament, it's almost as if we're witnessing a story already written. Annas and Caiaphas, by orchestrating the trial and condemnation of Jesus, were unknowingly fulfilling what had already been prophesied centuries before. The irony here is that, by trying to silence Jesus and protect their position, they ended up actively participating in God's plan for the redemption of the world. Besides Isaiah and the Psalms, another important prophecy is in Daniel 9, with the vision of the 70 weeks. Daniel prophesied the exact time when the Messiah would come and be cut off, but not for himself. This prophetic calculation, when applied, points directly to the period in which Jesus lived and was crucified. Daniel also speaks of a prince who would destroy the city and the sanctuary, which many scholars believe is a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Once again, we see that the prophecies not only speak of the Messiah, but also of the fate of Israel and the role of its religious leaders. Annas and Caiaphas, by rejecting Jesus, were directly connected to the fulfillment of these prophecies. What is interesting to note is that while Annas and Caiaphas believed they were preserving the power of Israel and the priesthood, they were in fact precipitating the end of an era. By rejecting Jesus, they not only fulfilled Scripture, but also accelerated the coming of a new time. Isaiah prophesied that the Messiah would be wounded for our transgressions, but he did not mention that his own religious leaders would be responsible for delivering the suffering servant. This connection between the prophecies and historical events is not a coincidence. It is the manifestation of a divine plan that was unfolding, even when it seemed like everything was out of control. These prophecies show us that God's plan is unchangeable, even when men try to change it. Annas and Caiaphas, in their pursuit of power and control, ended up becoming instruments for the words of the prophets to be fulfilled. This makes us think about how, many times, we too can be involved in something much bigger than we understand. Even without realizing it, our choices and actions can be directly connected to God's designs. Like Annas and Caiaphas, we may unwittingly be participating in divine history, whether by resisting or submitting to his purpose. Annas and Caiaphas were not simply mere observers in the events that led to the crucifixion of Jesus. They were protagonists, making decisions that shaped the course of history. Annas, although no longer the official high priest, had an authority that transcended the office. He was the first to interrogate Jesus after his arrest, in an attempt to undermine his influence and silence him before he could cause more damage to the established order. Caiaphas's role, however, was even more direct. As high priest, he presided over the trial of Jesus, bringing together the Sanhedrin in search of a verdict that would favor the execution. The motives behind these actions were complex, mixing both political and religious ambitions. The arrival of Jesus posed a threat to the stability of the priesthood and the alliance that the Jewish leaders had made with the Roman Empire. Caiaphas, in particular, saw in Jesus' popularity a risk to his own position. He feared that the Romans would intervene if there were a revolt among the people, which could result in the loss of power for the Jewish leaders. Thus, Caiaphas uttered that famous phrase, "It is better for one man to die for the people than for the nation to perish." At that moment, he sealed Jesus' fate, believing he was making a pragmatic decision to protect Israel. What's fascinating is that, unknowingly, Annas and Caiaphas were directly involved in fulfilling the prophecies they themselves knew so well. The decision to condemn Jesus to death seemed like a rational choice, born of fear and the preservation of power. But it was actually an intrinsic part of the divine plan. By acting against the Messiah, they were in fact aligning themselves with what the prophets had announced centuries before. Jesus needed to be rejected by the leaders of Israel, so that the plan of redemption could be realized. and Annas and Caiaphas, with all their attempts to maintain control, could not escape this destiny. Although their intentions were political, the actions of both had a much greater scope. They played a crucial role in the narrative of the redemption of humanity, even without realizing it. The fact that they were involved in something so deep, without fully understanding the consequences, leads us to reflect on how often we too can be immersed in events greater than we imagine. How many times do we think we are in control, when in reality we are just pieces of a plan that unfolds far beyond our comprehension? Annas and Caiaphas, then, teach us that, no matter how much we try to resist, God's plans always prevail. The tragic irony of their actions lies in the fact that, by condemning Jesus, they were contributing directly to the redemption they so eagerly awaited. Instead of accepting the Messiah and his mission, they chose to reject him, without realizing that their rejection was exactly what the prophecies said would happen. Even in resistance, they were serving the divine purpose. This leads us to a greater reflection on the role that each of us plays in God's plans, even when we don't fully understand them. The fate of Jerusalem was intertwined with the rejection of Jesus by the religious leaders. Annas and Caiaphas, by making the decision to condemn the Messiah, were not only sealing the fate of a man, but triggering a series of events that would culminate in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. This destruction, as predicted by Jesus, would mark the end of an era and be a clear sign that something new was about to begin. The temple, the center of worship and a symbol of God's presence among the people, would be razed, and with it, the sacrificial system that had defined Israel's relationship with the Most High for centuries. The link between the rejection of Jesus and the destruction of the temple is undeniable. When the religious leaders chose to reject the Messiah and maintain control of the temple, they didn't realize they were perpetuating a system destined to collapse. The new covenant, promised by the prophets, would come through the sacrifice of Jesus and no longer through the rituals of the temple. The fall of Jerusalem was, therefore, not only a historical tragedy, but the fulfillment of a spiritual judgment where the old gave way to the new. Annas and Caiaphas unwittingly contributed to the transition from an old order to the new. This new covenant would not be built around a physical building or animal sacrifices, but around Jesus Christ, the ultimate sacrifice. The Levitical priesthood, which Annas and Caiaphas represented, was coming to an end. With the destruction of the temple, there was no longer a place for the sacrifices to continue, and the priesthood lost its central function. This marked the transition to a new era, where the relationship with God would be mediated by Jesus, the true high priest. The figure of Caiaphas, who worked so hard to preserve the old system, therefore becomes a symbol of an order that needed to be overcome. It's amazing to think that, by rejecting Jesus, the religious leaders were accelerating the fulfillment of the prophecies that announced the fall of the temple. This teaches us that many times we try to resist the changes that God is bringing to our lives, without realizing that we are only hurrying what will inevitably come. The fall of Jerusalem was the final result of the rejection of the Messiah, but it was also the beginning of something greater and more lasting, the new covenant that would extend beyond the borders of Israel, reaching the whole world. Thus, the role of Annas and Caiaphas was not only significant in the trial of Jesus, but also in the spiritual transition of all humanity. The destruction of the temple in 70 AD was the final marker of a system they fought so hard to protect, but which had already fulfilled its purpose. The end of the Levitical priesthood and the inauguration of a new covenant through Jesus show that, even in the midst of resistance, God's plans are carried out sovereignly. The fate of Jerusalem, then, was both a judgment and a new beginning. By condemning Jesus, Annas and Caiaphas believed they were defending their nation, but they were actually contributing to something much greater than they could imagine: the redemption of humanity. Jesus was not just an uncomfortable prophet. He was the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who came to redeem fallen creation. The divine plan, which began in Eden, found its fullness in the sacrifice of Christ, and Annas and Caiaphas, unknowingly, played a fundamental role in this story. Through their rejection and condemnation of Jesus, the way was opened for salvation to be offered to all. Now, reflecting on this story, we are called to look at our own lives. How many times do we find ourselves resisting God's plans without realizing that we are part of something much bigger? Like Annas and Caiaphas, we often cling to our own interests without seeing the bigger picture. But regardless of our intentions, God's plan is fulfilled. And it is precisely in our weakness and resistance that His grace manifests itself most powerfully. This challenges us to ask, are we aligned with God's purposes, or are we fighting against them? This story also teaches us that, even in the midst of adversity, God is in control. Annas and Caiaphas thought they were in command, but God used their actions to bring redemption to the world. And in the same way, He can use even our failures and struggles to accomplish His perfect plans. The invitation here is clear. We must open ourselves to the paths that God has for us. If you are going through a time of difficulty or uncertainty, remember that God is working even when everything seems lost. The sacrifice of Jesus is the greatest proof that, in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him. Therefore, may we trust that, just as the prophecies were fulfilled in the past, God's plans continue to be fulfilled today. The rejection of Jesus by Annas and Caiaphas teaches us that, even when everything seems confused and out of control, God is always fulfilling His greater purpose. And if you want to learn more about how God's plans can surprise us, I invite you to watch the video I left on the screen. This next content will open your eyes to truths that you may never have considered. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. God bless you.